Thanks for joining me for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. As the world seeks to reduce carbon emissions, there is Canadian technology that will assist in our plans. I'm pleased to welcome two guests to discuss their solutions. David Robinson is the Managing Director of Hydrocarbon Combustion Solutions Inc., and Peter Lang is the President of Dunedin Energy Systems Limited. Welcome to Boom and Bust, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us, Tony.
Good to be here, Tony.
Peter, let's start with you. Could you describe the nature of the problem that you're seeking to solve in your sphere? And then, David, same question to you.
The small communities and military installations in northern and Arctic Canada are in desperate need of energy. And right now, the current diesel model that they've been using for decades now, it's unsatisfactory, it's expensive, it's a logistical nightmare, and of course, it is very carbon intensive. And they need alternative solutions, and the usual solutions don't work in that the solar and wind turbines simply don't work in the extreme cold and extended periods of darkness that they experience in the high Arctic.
David, what about you? What's the problem you're seeking to solve here?
So, Tony, one of the things that we need to find here is a bridge between today's reality and policy objectives that are very ambitious. And myself and some notable Canadians, including the former CEO of Siemens Canada and one of my other colleagues who was on Al Gore's team that won the Nobel Prize some years ago, have been monitoring a development that's really quite a breakthrough. And it was developed with about 9.5 million euros of European funding, 12 countries involved in a consortium that developed a very elegant method of CO2 capture, which is a very low pressure system with a very elegant membrane with a very advanced nanotechnology coating.
Excellent. Peter, coming back to you, maybe describe in a little bit more detail then the project of the development that you're seeking with this Canadian thermal battery.
Yes, the Canadian thermal battery is a solution that we've devised strictly for the Canadian northern and Arctic communities because the energy situation we have up there is very unique, and we strongly believe it needs a very unique Canadian solution, and that is the Canadian thermal battery. It is a micro-nuclear power plant that develops 2,400 kilowatts of thermal energy or 600 kilowatts of electricity or some combination of the two. And that's very important in the Arctic because they actually burn as much diesel for space heating as they do for electricity generation. So if you're only addressing electricity, you're missing half the problem.
Right. And so at what stage of development is your project right now?
We're in early stage development. We have done a couple of contracts, small contracts for the Department of Defense. They have some very logistically challenging military installations in the high Arctic, and they're interested in seeing further development up there. But like all projects, we're waiting for sustainable ongoing funding, and we're in a bit of a delay right now.
I'll return to that issue shortly, but David, yours is a carbon capture membrane modular plant. So tell us a little bit more about that.
So the current stage of development is a pilot plant that was attached to a very large industrial plant in Europe. Unfortunately, the pilot plant site is located in Latvia, which has a border with Russia. And as a consequence of the Russian conflict nearby, an opportunity is being created to attract the next stage of scale-up development to a safer location. So the current pilot plant was operating at 250 cubic meters an hour, capturing 90% of the CO2 out of the flue gas of an industrial plant that had about 6% CO2 content in the flue gas. So not dissimilar from a natural gas-fired power plant that's very common in Canada.
And are you seeking then, or do you have to kind of bid to have this plant in Canada then?
Well, there's a lot of international interest in it, and there's a very interesting development that's occurred just recently. Canada has just signed a joint committee on cooperation with the United Arab Emirates. And the United Arab Emirates will be hosting the Global Climate Change Summit in 2023 in Dubai. So there's a tremendous opportunity with a delegation from the UAE coming to Canada this month for the Carbon Expo CCUS conference in Edmonton, and an opportunity for dialogue with them about collaboration on this, which would allow Canada to be on the world stage potentially at the Global Climate Summit in 2023 with the announcement of the results of this scaled up pilot plant here in Canada. We've done a presentation for the oil sands producers in Alberta, their Pathways to Net Zero Alliance.
And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with our two guests. First, we have Peter Lang. He is the president of Dunedin Energy Systems Limited. We also have with us today David Robinson. He is very involved in the Hydrocarbon Combustion Solutions Inc. I think I got all the words there. So I guess what I'm interested in is kind of next stage. We'll have a kind of a two-parter for both you gentlemen. I do want to talk about funding, but first I want to talk about getting government's attention, if that is necessary, and if so, what the status of that is. So Peter, obviously you've been talking with Department of National Defense, it sounds like, but give us a sense of what's happening with your discussions with government on your project.
Yes, getting government attention has been difficult. I've attended many conferences, and especially I go across the north, the Arctic. I've spoken in Nunavut and Iqaluit and North Yellowknife and other locations. They're quite interested in any solution that will work for them in the dark season, as they call it. However, government is kind of siloed, and they each have their own area of interest, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of cross-pollination between the two of them. That said, interest hasn't been zero, but it has not resulted in the sort of sustainable funding that we need to keep this going. Gotcha.
Okay. David Robinson, it looks like you've got the interest of the Emiratis. Tell us a little bit more about your engagement with the Canadian government.
At this point, again, the same issue that Peter has mentioned. It's a challenge to get the attention and traction with the federal government or the provincial governments. They all have funding programs that are targeting carbon capture and CCUS now. You may be aware that there's a 50% investment credit that's being allowed now for expenditures on this. So that's really galvanized the emitter community. But it is difficult because you need to get the corporate sponsorship committed in order to get the matching funding from the government funding sources. So it's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. And unfortunately, if we don't act on this opportunity is going to be attracted to a safer location in a different country.
Yeah, so let's delve a little bit more deeply into financing. David, stick with you for a second. Funding obviously is always an impediment for these early stage issues. Where would you find funding for this, do you think?
Well, there's a number of groups that are corporate sponsors potentially, and we've had Japanese groups reach out to us. We've had good discussions in Canada with the oil sands producers and with the power producers and one petrochemical plant. So there's a real opportunity for them to scale up to the next level, which is about 1,000 cubic meters an hour for this modular solution. And it really addresses the concerns that they have. A lot of the power producers are very concerned about the parasitic energy consumption of other CO2 capture approaches, chemical approaches or mechanical approaches. I think everyone's familiar with the Boundary Dam situation in Saskatchewan, where the CO2 capture solution ate 25% of the electricity produced by the power plant. So that's unsustainable. For other producers, the challenge is how will the technology scale up to the size we need? And that's the beauty of this one. It's elegantly simple, literally a pressure differential across a membrane. It reminds me of the days of smog in the 1980s, where they said, well, here's a catalytic converter. And this is almost a similar approach.
Interesting. Peter, where are you looking for support and for funding?
Tony, it's very critically important that the government take an interest in this because of the very small size of our power unit. It is very hard to make an economic case for it to attract early stage private funding. This really is a project specifically for the Canadian Arctic and especially for the military. And, with the upcoming modernization of the North Warning System, which is going to have significantly higher power demands than the little 40 kilowatt generators they've got running up there, they really need to pay attention to this. I think it's also particularly important for the military to pay close attention because For the civilian application of this, and there is broad civilian application in all of the little communities up there, I have had more than one or two people from the north, Inuit, that have said, we look very favorably on what the military does here. And I don't see them getting ready acceptance in the civilian community until we've seen the military do it first. He was quite adamant about that.
Interesting. So that's why you're focusing in on the military applications. That makes a lot of sense to me. We're going to continue with our discussion with these very important topics and these Canadian innovations with our guests after a little bit of a break. We'll be back after the break. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, with our guests, Peter Lang and David Robinson. Peter, love to get your understanding of how your project will have an impact on reducing Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, and also a little bit more about economic development. I know that the two are tied in, but I'd love to get your sense of both. Start with you, Peter.
Well, from a greenhouse gas point of view, nuclear power plants are zero emissions in operation. And there's also an important component. We always think of greenhouse gas emissions, but in the north, and this is particularly important in the Arctic, is black carbon emissions, which come from diesel use. And all of the communities up there are powered with diesel. Black carbon accelerates melting by up to 30%, scientists believe. And the advantage of turning off black carbon is you see the effects of it immediately, as opposed to reducing greenhouse gases, which is important, but it takes years and decades for that to become effective. So, and this has been a major focus of the Arctic Council too, is reducing black carbon. Additionally, these units will run for over 20 years on a single fuel load. And so you're not only reducing the carbon emissions with the diesel generators, but those ships that are bringing up hundreds of millions of liters of diesel every year are also burning heavy fuel oil and emitting a lot of black carbon and CO2 in the process. And most of that will be able to be eliminated.
David, from your perspective, yours is more of a storage technology, but you obviously want to be part of the solution when it comes to GHG emissions.
Well, actually, we are at the front end of that process. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We're carbon capture. So This is a technology that captures 90% of the CO2 from the flue gas of a fossil fuel plant using combustion. So it's a really important element in the whole GHG reduction system, in that there's very many utilization approaches. You could, there's just straight sequestration. There's groups that are making carbon nanotubes and so on, but they all need to capture the carbon first in order to reduce the GHG emissions. And that's what this provides, an elegantly simple solution for CO2 capture that is scalable. It's literally modular like Lego, so that you increase the size. There's a simple rule in technology: complexity does not scale, simplicity does.
Sticking with you, David, do you think that this would have a positive impact on Canada's economic growth as well?
Well, it would be an opportunity for leadership. And you know what's really interesting about this specific relationship Canada's developed with the United Arab Emirates? It provides an opportunity for Canada's economic leadership in this dimension to be profiled on the world stage at the Global Climate Change Summit. So that's one interesting factor here. It's not only accomplishing that objective, but demonstrating it on the world stage. And that's really important. As you know, in any economic development activity, it's not only the economic function, but you have to have the marketing program that goes with it, right? The opportunity for other countries to acquire and utilize Canadian technology.
Peter, it seems to me, maybe it's self-evident, but let's underline it. If your solution can be deployed in the north, that will help, obviously, not only from the military point of view, but also economic development, right?
Absolutely. There's a direct correlation with an increased availability and low-cost clean power and economic development. And certainly in the process of developing and manufacturing these units, Canada is a tier 1 nuclear nation. We're really good at this. And all of the materials can be sourced within Canada to do this too. So there's no sort of foreign dependence required. except for a partial requirement to deal with the United States on some of the fuel. But regardless, we're really good at this. And this would also be a very high value added contribution to Canada's 40% of the North Warning System modernization. We're responsible for 40% of that. And we can do a lot better than concrete and steel. We can bring up high value added products to that.
Peter, are you concerned, or have you met concerns about using nuclear? Is that still an issue?
For the most part, it is. Most people in the North are very aware of where their power comes from. In the South, most people don't, but they all know where the power plant is and who runs it because they play hockey with them on Friday night. And so they have a very open mind as to how important it is to get an alternative source of energy. I have letters of encouragement to continue the development on this from various mayors of the Arctic communities and other groups up there, the Chamber of Mines in the Northwest Territory and Nunavut. They all support the continued development of this.
We're going to continue our discussion about these important innovations after the break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust with our two guests. Very interesting. Peter Lang, president of Dunedin Energy Systems, and also David Robinson, Hydrocarbon Combustion Solutions Inc. Peter, we were just talking in the break about the NATO connection with this as well, and some of the initiatives that are being done through that treaty organization. Maybe bring us up to date on that.
Sure, Tony. It was recently announced that Canada would be hosting the Defense Innovation Accelerator for North Atlantic, and this is a NATO innovation center, and it will be hosted here in Canada. Goes by the acronym of DIANA. All military things have an acronym. And one of the stipulations of the research is that wherever possible, these research projects should have a dual purpose, a dual capability, that is civilian and military. And of course, for the sake of the Dunedin Canadian nuclear thermal battery, rather, it does have exactly that. It has a combination civilian and military. This is all the defense research done at this institute will count towards our 2% NATO contribution that Canada has been lagging on somewhat. And yes, and can benefit the civilian society as well.
Interesting. David, I'm going to sort of throw a curveball a little bit at you first, but I am interested in how technology can be our way out of our emissions situation versus taxation. I mean, we know how controversial the carbon tax is. Do you think ultimately technology is going to be the solution?
You know, Tony, there's a great saying: there is no present, there is no future, just the past repeating over and over again. And I'll refer back to the one successful example of dealing with emissions, which was smog in the automobile industry. People said, you can't make automobiles, we'll all have to drive bicycles to work. And then the catalytic converter came along, a fairly elegant piece of technology. And surprisingly enough, in this technology, that's part of the effect of the coating. The nanotechnology coating exhibits something called the electrocatalytic effect, which is a very interesting feature for selectively separating CO2 from other elements of flue gas. So we've had the example in the past where technology has been adopted and has proven to be a solution for an emissions problem. I think maybe that's the way to go here. You can use a carrot and you can use a stick, but I think we're coming around to the thinking in government, at least, that maybe it's time for the carrot, and maybe the support of the CO2 capture aspect is an important feature to be supported.
Peter, I'd love to get your point of view on this. The reason I raise it is because most of the public is much more aware of the carbon tax as our response to climate change, but it seems to me that it's the technology that can drive the real change. I'd love your commentary on this.
Well, I agree completely that it is the technology. And in this particular part of the world that Dunedin is focusing on, Northern and Arctic Canada, it is the solution. Senator Dennis Patterson from Nunavut recently commented in the Hill Times that he said, wind and solar don't work in the far north. It is too cold and too dark, and that's exactly when you need the power the most. So the alternative is diesel, and that's why they're still using it. So we need a new solution and a zero emissions 24/7 solution that is not affected by wind, weather, or sunshine is what we need, and we can do it. We're good at this. We can do this.
We've got about 30 seconds left, Peter. I'd love to get your sense of how you're working with Indigenous communities too.
Well, wherever possible, I try and get up to the Arctic a number of times a year and to speak at public meetings. And I'm hoping to be speaking at the Northern Lights conference coming up soon in Ottawa, which has a lot of Indigenous participation. And to always ask, I ask them, I try and listen, ask, and then listen to what they say. And generally speaking, they have an open mind. It's, you have to build your trust gradually, but there's no sort of hard no. They want to know, tell me more, is usually the response I get. Tell me more.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have time for more on this program. Gentlemen, you've been great guests. Peter and David, thank you and best of luck with your projects. Very interesting discussion with two entrepreneurs, Canadian entrepreneurs with some very interesting, innovative technology solutions to reduce our exposure on greenhouse gas emissions, obviously in early stages, but definitely a lot of promise for not only the technology, but to assist our communities as well. So love to have those kinds of programs on Boom and Bust. Thanks for watching today.